Today I'm going to show you how to cycle a saltwater aquarium quickly and properly while also minimising the so-called ugly stage. And at the end of the video I'll answer the most frequently asked questions about cycling a saltwater aquarium. And if it's your first time here and you want a new reefing video every week, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out when I upload. Now this is a method I've refined over the years and is the way I've set up each of my current tanks and will be the method I use from here on in, as I've had no major algae outbreaks on either tank, which are now just under 4 years old and 1 year old respectively. And this is not a sponsored video, so I bought everything you see with my own money. Now I'm assuming you will have already added rock, sand, salt water and a heater. But before you start, it's important to check your temperature is at around 25 degrees C or 77 Fahrenheit, and that your salinity is somewhere around 35 parts per thousand or 1.026. Once you've done that, you're ready to start. In years gone by, the advice was to add a frozen pond to your tank and let it decay. As that happens, bacteria will then appear naturally and build up until the population is big enough to break down the ammonia and nitrite that is toxic to our fish. But there's really no good reason to do that now, as you can simply buy those bacteria ready to go in a bottle. So all you need to do is add a bottle of nitrifying bacteria to your tank. I'm using ATM Colony, but there are various other options such as Dr. Tim's and Fritz TurboStar. They're all the same, just make sure you choose a bottle that's rated for salt water, not fresh water, as the freshwater bacteria are a different strain. This bottle of ATM Colony is rated at 95 litres and my tank holds around 90 litres of water after displacement for the rock and sand. The bottles are pretty cheap though, and it's much better to get a bottle too large for your tank than too small. As long as the water's salinity and temperature are right, you can then add your first fish instantly. There's no need to wait even a day, and in fact it's better to add your fish in the first few days, as they will then produce the ammonia your new bacteria need to survive. You'll want to make sure any filters you have, like a skimmer or UV sterilizer, are turned off so they don't remove the bacteria before they have a chance to settle. Although if your filter is the only thing in your tank that creates water movement, leave it on or add a small power head instead to ensure your tank stays oxygenated so your fish can breathe and bacteria can multiply. Now ammonia is really nasty stuff. If you breathe in pure ammonia, it will make your nose bleed. So swimming around in the stuff is torture for fish, which is why it's massively important to test ammonia and nitrite for the first week or two to make sure the bacteria is doing its job. For ammonia, these little SeaChem ammonia alerts are the best option. They cost less than a tenner, which is cheaper than most test kits, and they permanently monitor ammonia levels in your tank, which saves you the faff of having to carry out the test procedure. And they last a year, so you won't have to worry about it expiring. There's no equivalent for nitrite, so just buy a cheap nitrite test kit and check a couple of times in your first week or two to make sure all is well. Now I personally like to add a small piece of live rock I've bought from my local fish shop, as well as the bottle bacteria. Live rock is really valuable in a reef tank, and it will already be populated with nitrifying bacteria, so you can think of it as belt and braces. I also like to add an algae eating fish early on. If your tank is big enough, my personal preference is a one-spot foxface, as they are much more peaceful than tangs and won't bully your future tank mates. But a small tang like this Tomini tang is also a good option for a small tank. In the short term they'll be fine in a tank of around 100 litres or 25 gallons, but really you want a tank double that size to care for even a smaller tang in the long term. So be prepared to catch and move the fish on if you have a small tank. And an urchin like this blue tuxedo urchin is an excellent alternative if your tank is too small for an algae eating fish. And that segues nicely into the most frequently asked questions about cycling. Question number 1. When should I add my first cleanup crew? It's fine to add scavengers like cleaner shrimp or hermit crabs straight away, as they'll eat any scraps of food your fish miss. But things like snails and urchins will depend on the algae that will grow over time, so it's best to wait a few weeks before adding them. You'll likely get a brown dusting on your rocks and sand after a few weeks. Those are diatoms, which are basically the bottom of the food chain, so that is a great time to add snails and an urchin, and it won't hurt to use that as your start point for all cleanup crew. Question number 2. How much should I feed? The bottle bacteria will tell you to feed lightly for the first few days. The best way to do that is with pellet food, as it's easy to measure out. I just add a tiny amount no bigger than your pinky fingernail once a day. The last thing you want to do is overload a new system with uneaten food, and a couple of clownfish will be just fine in the early days with a small meal. Question number 3, can I turn my lights on? I always turn my lights on from day one. If you can turn the brights down, then start nice and low, maybe around 20 or 30%, so as not to encourage algae growth too much. But if you have a fixed power light, just put it on a short timer for say 6 hours a day and build up to the full 12 hours over the course of a month or so. Question number 4, should I do water changes? For the first few weeks, you'll want to avoid water changes, as your tank will have pretty much no nutrients to remove anyway, and all you'll do is remove some of the free-floating bacteria in the water column. But after that initial stage, I always start doing 10% water changes every week, and I can't recommend regular water changes enough, so aim to start weekly water changes after around a month or so, and carry on forever. Question number 5, can I use distilled or tap water? The answer to this is a resounding no. You should only use RODI water, as you don't want to introduce any unnecessary pollutants. In this hobby, you'll often hear people say we keep water, not fish and corals, so getting water right is paramount and not an area to cut corners on. Question number 6, when can I add corals or an anemone? Corals just don't do well in a new tank, so you'll want to wait for a couple of months before adding your first coral. I've seen some people argue adding corals early increases the biodiversity in a new tank, which is a good thing. But that's better advice for experienced reef keepers who know how to care for corals in a sterile new tank, and who can recognise the signs a coral is dying, not just sulking, and who know what to do when a coral does start to die. And if you really want more biodiversity, just buy a small piece of live rock. However, if you really must add a coral early on, make sure it's a hardy soft coral, and only spend as much money as you're prepared to lose, as there's every chance it will fade and die. As for anemones, by reputation, they really don't do well in a new tank. They're tricky animals to keep too, so steer clear until your tank is at least 6 months old, and use that time to better research their exacting care requirements. Although I would say that I've never kept an anemone personally, so this advice is based on the accepted wisdom rather than my personal experience. Now those are the most commonly asked questions I've found on this topic, but if I've missed anything, ask in the comments section below, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for next week. And until next time, happy reefing.